All right, everyone. So today we're going to continue learning about the progressive era. And the way our standards are written, it's very kind of all over the place. We can't really focus on one without the other. So in this particular strand that we're going to be learning on, we're just going to cover all the standards. We're just going to focus on different areas of those strands, of those standards. And so today we're going to talk about economic reforms. Next time, we'll talk about political reforms of the progressive era, and then we'll finish up with social reforms of the progressive era. So that's how we're going to do that. The standards are all right here. I've highlighted the ones that we're going to focus on, the parts that we're going to focus on in today's lecture, which is dealing with economic reform. So we're going to talk about things like organized labor, the changing of laws, which we'll continue. We'll talk about changing the laws in other areas and future ones. We'll talk about unions, and we'll talk about reform movements itself. So today, the essential questions are just identify and explain how labor influenced American workplace during the progressive era. And the second question is identify and explain how the progressive presidents changed the relationship between government and business. So I always start out with some context. Here's the situations before what we're going to get into. So most Americans at this time are, in the later half of the 1800s, are all working industrialized jobs. Either they're going to be working in factories, they're working in mines, they're working in, as lumberjacks, whatever it was an industrial related job. That's what most Americans, shifting away from when most Americans were farmers. Most of them were working 10 plus hours a day and 6 days a week. The only day of the week they did not get off, it was Sunday. And they could barely survive based off of the wages that they were being given. So this is going to open up where something needs to change. And so laborers are going to soon learn that they can unite and use their strength in numbers to leverage and influence business owners and management to give them some things that can help improve their lives as workers in American industries. On top of that, big businesses, which we've been talking about for a while, are virtually unchecked, unregulated by the government. And because because the government was using the laissez-faire policy and just letting businesses run themselves, you do have issues that do arise, which we've talked about in the past. This is where people start to question whether laissez-faire policies are the right way, or should the government take a more hands-on approach, something we'll talk about a little bit more in the lecture. So I'm going to start with unions. And unions and labor unions are organizations that are representing the workers and their interests to try to negotiate better deals for them in terms of wages, work hours, safety conditions, and there's a lot of those things that do exist. The first unions come about in the 1700s, the late 1700s, but some of the ones we're going to talk about today don't only just go within, like, say, one factory and a union of workers within that factory. It's going to be an expansion of unions that go across the country to different jobs and skills and companies they belong to. They emerge over time, as they're trying to fight for better work conditions, pay, etc. And management would do very much what they could to try to break up these unions, because they understood that if they didn't have leverage over the workers, they could lose profits in some way. So, once workers start fighting and joining unions and fighting against low wages and other things, then that management would have to pony up, and that would take money away from the profits. So they did try to do what they could. Not all of them, but a lot of them tried to discourage unionization and allowing these to happen. On top of that, they had a lot of other obstacles, unions in their country. For a long time, a very unfriendly government. While the unions were legal, they did not always vote in their side, or create policies that favor labor unions, or court cases in which oftentimes management was they were ruled in favor of management rather than the workers themselves. There's always disagreements among workers. What's the thing that they want to take on? Some wanted to take on things that affected them directly. Some wanted to expand and talk about things that, trying to overthrow the American capitalist system. So we'll talk about some examples of that a little bit later. And a lot of them excluded African Americans and female workers from their unions, which means that not all voices were represented in unions when they did ultimately try to fight for the things they do fight for. So there's a variety of strategies that were used by unions to bring about change. One is the boycott, where if a company was selling a product and they were mistreating the workers, they called for boycotts of that product, because if enough people stopped buying it, then the company would go bankrupt. And so They could either work with the unions and try to give them things that they want, or they could go bankrupt. So that was one strategy. Another one is sabotage, and to where they would destroy industrial equipment to bring about changes and such. This is an extreme, comparatively, to strategy to the others and such, but it did happen where, like, oh, hey, the furnace is down. Hey, while you're fixing that, maybe put in a guardrail like we've been asking for so we don't fall into the molten steel. So those are things that were done. But the most common one was the strike. And this is where all workers just generally agree to stop working, to force management's hand to give them what they wanted. If all the workers of a factory decide to strike, then obviously the factory is shut down. If the factory is shut down, they're not making the product, they're not making money. So it leverages more for the workers so that the business owners and the management will sit down and negotiate with them to give them things that they want. They may not get everything, but if you can get a little bit at a time, you work towards the things that you want to achieve overall. As you know, the same thing happens today with unions today. While strikes are much more rare, they do happen. There's teachers unions, which what I'm a member of, where they negotiate our contracts and our work hours and other things on our behalf. And so that's something that they do, and I've never had to strike in my life. So one strike, though, that did happen that has huge implications of history of our country is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And this is when railroad workers refused to operate the trains in West Virginia. These workers were being docked their pay because I don't even really know. They just, they over a 2-month period, 20% of their paychecks had been docked, and they no longer paid them that. So obviously the workers are going to be very upset by this, and they decide to strike. And so they pull all of the rail lines or all the engines and trains into a station. What's the term I'm looking for? Rail yard, yeah, and basically block them off from being able to leave. And so the railroad had shut down in West Virginia. And so this is a problem because railroads, they move people and they move products and goods. And so this has huge economic implications when they shut it down. It's not the only time where railroads have striked, and that's really got people nervous, right? In response, they try to break them up with the and free these trains with the local police. They do not have the numbers. So the management calls West Virginia's governor and say, hey, can you help us here? And he essentially kind of formulates what becomes known now as the National Guard. And the National Guard was sent in to try to break this up. And they didn't succeed. And eventually it was federal troops that were sent by Rutherford B. Hayes, the president at the time, that went in with enough firepower and force to be able to get these trains freed from this yard to keep them moving and so forth. So even though strike did fail, it did show the workers the power of the strike, as well as the creation of the National Guard, which comes about from this moment. Strikes do have varying degrees of success, and they do force management to listen to workers oftentimes, but management has ways to fight back. They could bring in replacement workers known as scabs. They can enact a lockout, which basically is a reverse strike. It can simply shut down the factory and say, hey, I can wait this out longer than you can. I'm losing money, but you are losing your livelihood. So if you don't like it, then shut up and get back to work, right? They also would force employees to sign what called yellow dog contracts, which basically said that they pledge not to join any unions. And if they do, they can fire them. And they also blacklisted union members or known agitators from being able to work to keep their influence out of their workplace and to encourage the workers to unite against the management. There are also times where they use force, like sending police to crack in skulls, for workers who refuse to do their jobs. So, yeah, these are things that did occur in this era. So the early labor movement kind of starts with the National Labor Organization. And so the National Labor Union, which is about 200,000 strong, was the first union that goes across different skills and different industries. And they are fighting for and supporting each other to fight for both higher wages and shorter work hours, things that directly affect the workers. They do push beyond that, though. And some of the things that they do push for is like an end to prison labor. And why they might do this is very simply that they didn't want competition, because if you can bring slave labor, essentially prison workers, to do jobs that labor or union members could be doing, that helps bring down the wages and it makes it tougher for them to compete for better pay. So they fought for things like that. And there's some social justice stuff that they also fought for too. The limitation of their influence was because they only allowed white males to join. So you have only one voice of the demographics of the working place and the work environment being represented by this union. Over time, the Knights of Labor would supplant them as the largest union in the country. And for them, they didn't see race or gender or skilled or unskilled workers as barriers to what they wanted to accomplish. For them, they saw they're all part of the working class, so they should all be united in this movement in front to try to bring about changes for the working class people. So they admitted all wage earners, including blacks and female and a whole bunch of others, and they advocated for things that you would expect: better pay, shorter hours, better working conditions. But they also advocated for things like limitations on immigration. They wanted less immigrants. And you could probably imagine why that is, because immigrants represented competition for those workers. And they would come in and they would work for less and make it harder for them to be able to get decent wages. So they're against those things. They were against child labor. It's not because child labor is terrible, because back then child labor was just child labor. It happened. People who were, under 18 years old worked on farms for the longest time. And so the shift over to industry wasn't as alarming as it is for us today. But then child labor was also representing competition. Once again, they are cheaper. They take up jobs away from adults. So they want to get rid of child labor and open up the workforce for the American adults. They were, for government ownership of railroads, telephone lines, telegraphs, because those companies price gouged American workers and especially farmers. So they wanted some regulation on these things. So this goes well beyond just kind of the directly affecting the workers. They want to overthrow the system as it is to make government more in charge of parts of our economy. However, despite the success that the Knights of Labor do have for the period of time, the overall success is stopped with one particular incident that turns people's opinion, public opinion, against not just the Knights of Labor, but organized labor in general. And that was the Haymarket Square bombing, also known as the Haymarket Riot. This event is probably one of the more important events in American history. You could say that America would be very different if this didn't happen and the unions continued to move in the direction that they did. But on May 4th, 1886, there was a strike that involved the Knights of Labor that were fighting for the 8-hour workday. They were fighting against Andrew Carnegie and Andrew Carnegie's steel mills to provide better work hours for the workers. During the strike and such, they're all in this crowded Haymarket Square and such, and there's police officers there to, break up or stop the workers from becoming violent. Who knows what happens or who did it? No one knows for sure. But a bomb was tossed into, the crowd of police officers, in which one was killed and many were injured. When this happened, no one knows again who did this, but the blame ultimately lands at the feet of the Knights of Labor. And management and anti-unionists jump all over this story. And in the newspapers, they brand them as disorganized labor, as filled with thugs and criminals, socialists and anarchists, people who want to disrupt and overthrow America and destroy it as it is. And so the public opinion turns on the Knights of Labor, and after that happens, labor unions that not only or that are taking on social issues and other issues beyond just kind of the normal workplace issues do not resonate well with the vast majority of Americans. Even today, unions do not call for an entire overthrow of our political system. The Knights of Labor, they were kind of heading in that direction. One union that does have a great deal of success in terms of changing the American workplace was the American Federation of Labor. And so this was a more exclusive labor union that only allowed skilled workers in. Unskilled workers would not be allowed. And they are going to not fight for the transformation of American capitalist free market system, but to basically make it so that the American workers were better taken care of in these industries. So they fought for things that were important directly to them. The bread and butter approach is what it's called, or they keep it simple, by Samuel Gompers, who is the head of this organization. He's going to go fight for things just like better pay, shorter hours, health benefits, and of course, safer working conditions. Four things that really do resonate with Americans and see and understand. So because of the American Federation of Labor, you will see these practices and a government who is more willing to protect these practices of businesses to protect the American worker, pay them better, give them better hours. And that comes about because of labor unions. And these are very realistic goals that labor unions fought for and were able to achieve. But despite the success of the AFL and the downfall of the Knights of Labor, it doesn't mean that radicalism, that those labor unions and those people of that mindset who want to continue to try to overthrow the free market system of America, there were some people that did prescribe to Karl Marx's ideas of socialism. Now, Karl Marx was a German philosopher who wanted to see the workers of the world unite and overthrow the systems as they are to create a system where everyone was considered more equal and so forth. And, this is something that does resonate with a very small faction of Americans at this time. So one example is Eugene V. Debs, who was the head of the American Railway Union, was a big prescriber of Karl Marx's ideas. And he wanted to see an overthrow of American system of capitalism in favor of socialism, more so where the government takes over and runs certain industries and businesses like the railroads, like factory work and things like that. Even though he runs for president 5 times, the most he's able to get in terms of percentage of vote was 6% in 1912. And so even Eugene V. Debs, who is known as the father of American socialism, his popularity does not resonate with the vast majority of Americans. Americans tended to, when the issues of industrialization come about, and this is very important, so something you should remember, okay? When the ideas or the problems with industrialization come about, in places like Europe and Russia, to deal with those situations, they want the government to entirely take over industries and do it the right way. In America, we don't opt for a takeover of the industry. We opt for more regulation. So private businesses are allowed to continue to exist and practice and provide the vast majority of goods and services to the American people, but they are regulated by laws of the American government, some of which we'll talk about in our next little section here. So the other group that kind of comes about that really was pushing for more socialism in our country, and i.e. the world, was the Industrial Workers of the World. They were also known as the Wobblies. And so they believed in more direct action against management and to create a worker uprising. And so they never truly caught on in American society. But they are worth noting because American socialism did exist and it did creep into politics and other things, society during this era. It's not the only era. Socialism still comes up in parts of today. With the election coming soon, people accuse the Democratic Party of supporting socialist actions and such. And that's not me for say or judge either way what's going on, but I will say public schools is considered a socialist program. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are all government-run, things that affect the economy. So taking on big businesses is another thing that, as far as economic reforms. In 1890, a law was passed known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was supposed to be used to break up some of the railroads that were practicing things like price gouging and other things that was affecting the American workers, farmers, essentially the little guy, right? It was essentially used to allow the government to break up monopolies. Even today, in the news today, like the House of Representatives basically have said that Amazon and Apple and some other companies are practicing monopolies in the current day, and that you know the government does have the right to break them up if they truly desire or have clear evidence that they are monopolies, right? So the 12 years following the Sherman Antitrust Act passage were never used to enforce this. It was generally it was a paper tiger is what they call it. It was a law that wasn't enforced. Enter Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes president when the president of the United States that was elected in 1896 was assassinated in 1899. His name is William McKinley. Teddy Roosevelt comes into office, and he is going to be the most progressive president to that date. And so he kind of brands himself as a trust buster, and he wants to give everyone, as he calls, the square deal, which is his domestic policy in which he wants to make and improve the lives of ordinary Americans. And in part of that would to be break up the businesses that do exist, because he sees the monopolies as creating a lack of competition. When you have only one company providing the service, then you do not get to tie and choose for a better price. You don't get to choose a better quality product. Today, we have multiple companies that provide the same thing, like, for example, cell phones. We have Apple, we have Motorola, we have Android, all those. And so because of that competition, you have businesses who are vying for your money. So they're going to try to create a better quality product, a better price product, and other things. And that's better for the consumer. So that's something why he is going to go and become the trust buster. And so he uses the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after Northern Securities Railroad and break that up into multiple railroad companies so they compete with each other for prices that's better for the worker and for the consumer. By the time of his end of office, he ends up taking on 45 major companies and busts them up to multiple companies, rather than allowing them to continue to exist as monopolies. On top of that, because I mentioned Americans do not accept socialism by and large, but they do accept the fact that a government that is going to regulate private businesses so that they do practice ethical business practices and protect consumers' interests and so forth. So things like the Elkins Act, which basically would give penalties to railroad companies that were giving rebates to companies that were kind of in cahoots with each other. Hepburn Act, which would allow the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroad rates and go after finance companies if they were not being forthright in their businesses and the money they're making, and money for investors. Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act I've mentioned in the previous lecture. This is the acts that came directly as a result of the jungle. And so not only do they regulate the food industry and food and drug industry, it opens the door up that the government has the power to regulate pretty much any industry it wanted to, so that it is working supposedly in the interest of the American people. And that's debatable, but it's what is intended to happen as well. I love Teddy Roosevelt, so I'm just going to put this here. You can read it on the PowerPoints yourself if you like. The handpicked successor of Teddy Roosevelt was the next of the progressive presidents, and his name is William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft is the real trust buster. Teddy Roosevelt is, famous for being the guy who goes after these businesses, but comparatively, William Howard Taft almost doubles the amount of monopolies that he breaks up. 80 different lawsuits to break up these monopolistic trusts. In 1911, he goes after one of the biggest, and maybe the biggest and more powerful of the monopolies, and that was the Standard Oil Company. That's John D. Rockefeller's company. He breaks it up to where it's not Standard Oil anymore. There's Exxon, there's Chevron, there's a lot of other ons that provide gas and refined oil today. And so competition among itself helps regulate prices, right? Taft also filed suit against JP Morgan's U.S. Steel Company. And this infuriated Teddy Roosevelt because Teddy Roosevelt had a kind of an agreement with JP Morgan that he would be allowed to run these companies and do what he was doing as long as he didn't do certain practices. But Howard Taft went after JP Morgan anyway. And so this angered Teddy Roosevelt that ends up coming out of retirement and going for a third term as president. And he runs independently, which ends up breaking or splitting the progressive vote, which opened the door for a much less progressive president in Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson, I would say, was not a non-progressive president. He is the third of the progressive presidents, but he was a little less progressive than the previous two. So he supported things like states' rights and the limitation of federal government in business. However, he did do some progressive things, such as lowering tariffs. He created the banking system where we don't have individual banks that are kind of in control. He has the Federal Reserve System, which controls our banking system and creates 12 Federal Reserve banks that control the circulation of money. They control the interest rates, things that have huge economic implications. The most powerful person in America may not be the president of the United States. It may most likely be the chairman of the Federal Reserve because they control the money. The Clayton Antitrust Act would outlaw unfair business practices such as predatory pricing. The FTC was created from that helps go after businesses that do these unfair practices. And then in other reforms, I mean, he signs child labor laws that doesn't fully get rid of child labor, but it certainly limits it in a large way. Brings aid to farmers, the 8-hour workday. And for railroad workers, he signs that into law, which would open the door for the 8-hour workday for all workers. So those are things that happen under Woodrow Wilson. So that's why he becomes the third president of the progressive presidents. And there's some other things that we'll talk about with social and political reforms that Wilson was also part of, as well as Taft and Roosevelt. So here's your essential questions once again. Identify and explain how labor influenced the American workplace in the progressive era. And identify and explain how progressive presidents changed the relationship between government and business. So with that being said, next time, and it will be Friday, a distance learning day for those who are in class, but for everyone on Friday, you'll have another topic relating to the progressive era, and it will be the political reforms that happen as a result of the progressive era. So that's it from Mr. Henry's classroom. I'll see you all next time.